Hello cyberspace, my name is Garrett Mills and welcome to episode 5 in my PHP development tutorial series. In this episode we're going to take a look at errors and exceptions and how to handle them. If you haven't, I recommend beginning at the beginning of this series and working your way through to this point because we're sort of building on a framework that we created last time. So to do that, you can click the little I in the top right hand corner of this video and that'll take you to the playlist that has all the videos for this series. So, like I said, in this episode we're going to take a look at errors and exceptions and how to handle them. So, an error obviously is a fairly straightforward concept. If something is not done correctly, or there's a problem with your code, or a problem with logic or whatnot, an error is going to occur. Now in PHP, errors are really two different things. There is a fatal error, which causes the execution of the PHP script to stop. So once it hits that error, it stops executing PHP and returns the error to the client. Or there's a warning. And warnings are errors that don't stop the script. So you'll see a warning, but your script will keep executing. Whereas exceptions in PHP are sort of the new object-oriented way of handling errors, and it allows a little bit cleaner and more streamlined process for dealing with custom types of errors and handling them properly. So we're going to start out by looking at errors. So when you're differentiating between errors and exceptions, an error is generally used in a more scripted page, so a page that relies mostly on script that runs on a single page. It doesn't pull in classes, it doesn't deal with object-oriented programming very much. It's more focused on the script rather than an object application. And so we're going to take a look at that first. So we've got this basic form from our last couple of videos going that takes input, sanitizes it, validates it, and then the eventual goal will be to sign the user up for a newsletter. And so what happens now is when they get to this index.php page, they see a sign up form. And then when they submit that form, it validates all of the input to make sure that there's no problems, no malicious code, or also to make sure that it meets all of the requirements. And then if that works, then it sends it to handler, and the handler sets a session variable for the first name and redirects the user to the thank you page. And the thank you page just pulls the name from the session and tells the user thanks. So let's say for whatever reason we want to make sure that nobody can send a post request to this page, this thanks.php page. For some security reasons, say you've got some handler that uses this page and you need to be sure that post requests can't be sent, only GET requests, and you don't want it to continue loading if it receives a GET request, post request. So there are two ways that we can do this. Either we can just put all of our HTML in an if tag that says if request method equals GET, then display this. Or we could throw an error when the session request method is post. So like we did in here, we want to check if it equals post. So up here, before we even start the session, if the server's request method is post, then we want to throw an error. And so in PHP, the way you throw errors is with the die function. So this die function, when called, ends all execution of PHP and returns the response as an error to the client. So what we can see is that if we send a GET request to this page, it's going to handle it normally and just thank the user for joining the newsletter. But if we send a post request, then it's going to call this die function and the page is going to error out. So we can't test this very easily from a web browser because web browsers by default send GET requests unless it's, say, a form or something. And so to test this, I'm going to use a little program called Insomnia. Insomnia is a REST API development tool that helps you debug and test different requests and functions for a server, or sort of a back-end focused development workflow. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about this program, you can click the eye in the top right-hand corner of this video to watch my spotlight review of it. So now that we're in Insomnia, we're going to create a new request. We're just going to name this request something, so thanks error test. And we want to make sure that it's set to a post request, and then we want to put in URL of this thanks page. So in my case, it's dev.local/php tutorial1/thanks.php. And so if we send this, we see we don't get any of this thanks for joining our newsletter message. We just get no response. Well, we get a response. We don't get any content in the source body. And this is because while the PHP stopped executing, it didn't have any way, like, we didn't tell it what to do once it hits that die function. So an important thing to do as you're writing errors into your code is to make them descriptive. Tell the user why they got an error. Be specific. So in here we want to put a message. We can put the first parameter of the die function is the message. So we're going to say error post requests not allowed. And so now if we send the request again, we get the error post request not allowed. And when you see, we don't get any of the rest of the HTML or the any of the welcome code or anything. So that's just some basic getting started fundamentals for using errors, the die function, and writing logic and descriptives into your code. So the next thing we're going to take a look at is exceptions. So the introduction of PHP 5 quite a while ago introduced a new error mechanic known as the exception. Now, exceptions are sort of building on the framework for errors. They have more of an object-oriented approach, and it gives the developer more control over the flow of the error handling. So rather than just dying and stopping all of the code execution, when an exception is called, it can be custom handled by the code. So the code has mechanics to detect if a certain exception occurs, and when it is thrown, which is the exception lingo for when an exception happens, when it's thrown, a custom handler can be executed instead of just stopping all of the code and ending the script. So let's say you don't want to forbid post requests to this URL, but instead you just want to send a message. You just want to have a little bit of text show up on the screen that says it's not recommended to use post requests on this page. So we can remove our code here. Say we want to have it down here. So if server request method equals post, then we're going to throw an exception. So the keyword for throwing an exception is throw, not drown, throw. And since exceptions are classes in an object-oriented approach, you have to create new instances of them. So throw new exception, and then exception takes a parameter message. So in this case, the use of post requests to this page is not advised. So if there's a post request sent to this page, it's going to throw an exception. The use of post request to this page is not advised. So let's send our post request again. You can see that we have some HTML, but if we get down here, we see we've got a PHP string. And so let's see, look at the web view, it's a little easier to see. We see we have a PHP error, fatal error, uncaught exception. So I did say that exceptions don't necessarily always end the execution of your code. However, you have to catch the exceptions. So the way catching exceptions works, and it's a bit unique if you aren't familiar with it, is you put the code that has the possibility of throwing an exception inside of a try-catch block of logic. And what this block of logic does is it listens for an exception, and when it finds an exception, it allows you to handle it a certain way rather than just ending all the code. However, if you throw an exception straight up without any catching or handling, it's going to act just like a fatal error. So we don't necessarily want it to fatal error, we just want to display a message. So to do this, we're going to use a little bit of new syntax that we might not have seen yet, the try-catch switch. So it starts out with a block of code that it's going to try. It's going to try to run this code, and we're going to see if it throws any exceptions. So try all of this code in here, and then from that code, catch any exceptions. So we're going to try and catch exception type exception, and we want PHP to put the exception in the variable e. That way we can access it. So it's going to try this code, and if this code throws an exception, then it's going to send that exception down here, and we can handle it ourselves. So say rather than submitting a fatal error, we just display a head tag that says the use of post requests to this page is not advised. So we can do this by just echoing it out. Echo H3, H3. And so in doing this, we don't necessarily have to hard code in the message down here because we're setting it up here. So rather than just hard coding it in, we can be more dynamic with our code. So we want to get the exception from this variable e. We want to get the message. So get message and display it in some head tags. So now what this is going to do is it's going to try to run this block of code. And if this block of code throws an exception type exception, then it's going to execute the code down here. So we can test this out by jumping back over to Insomnia and sending our request again. And so you can see that it didn't display this bit because we don't have any sessions set for the subscribe form because we're just trying it from in here, but we don't get a fatal error anymore. We get our handler. So the use of post requests to this page is not advised. And if our session variables were set, then we would see all of the same code. And we can prove this by looking at the source. You can see we still have these body and HTML tags that are down here. So we know that the PHP didn't stop executing down here. It kept going through to the end of the page. And so that's all fine and good, but what if we want to make sure that this is a specific kind of exception? Not just any exception should be able to get its own H3 message. We want a specific type of exception, a specific post request error exception or whatever. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we had to have this new keyword here because exceptions are classes. Meaning we can leverage the object-oriented properties of that class and create our own custom exception. So up here in the head, above the HTML, before any of the rest of our PHP code starts executing, we want to define our own custom exception. So it's obviously a class. So class is the keyword for defining a PHP class. Class, then the name, so post request warning exception. So the name of the class, and it's best practice to begin your class with a capital letter and then to include the word exception at the end so that we know it's an exception. And then obviously we want to do a little bit of inheritance. We want to extend the exception class. And so if you're not familiar with object-oriented programming, this may look a little daunting, but trust me, it's not. We'll talk about it in greater length in a later video. But a class is just an object. It's a thing. So exception is a class that if we go and look at it, it just contains a set of functions, a set of variables that are accessible through that class. And so other classes can extend that object. So our class postRequestWarningException extends exception. This just means that it contains all of the variables and properties that exception contains. It just has a different name, and we can add our own things to it. Now we don't really need to add anything to it, we just defined the type. So we're basically done in this class. All we have to do is terminate our curly braces so that PHP knows the class has been defined, and then we have our own custom request exception class. So rather than just throwing a new exception, we can throw our postRequestWarningException, and we can try postRequestWarningException down here. And so this should yield the same result as before. So we can send our request, and we see the use of postRequest to this page is not advised. But now the benefit to this is if other exceptions get thrown that aren't specifically postRequestWarningExceptions, there are other types of exceptions, they can be handled independently. So say this is a production application and we don't want to show the user all of the exceptions. Well, we can have another catch down here for just exceptions. And this is just going to do nothing because we don't want the exceptions shown to the user. So now, if this were just an exception, and we go here and send it again, you see nothing happens. We don't get this error message displayed because it's not the specific type of exception that we want the user to see. So this is just a good way of cleaning up your code and making sure that in production you have a great amount of control over errors and exception handling and exactly what the user and the other developers are going to see when they're interacting with your code or your API. And so building on this post request exception just a little bit, if we think about it, this message here, the use of post requests to this page is not advised, that's not going to change from page to page or from error to error. When this is called, that's almost always going to be the message that gets sent or displayed to the user because it's a pretty specific, pretty straightforward exception. And so rather than having to type this in and set it every single time we call the request, we can actually set it in our class. So when classes are created or instantiated through this new operator, there's a built-in function that is called construct. And that function, public function construct, begins with 2 underscores. And so we can see that for our post request warning exception, the construct function takes the message, the error code, and the exception, and it sends them to the parent so that exception is initialized properly. And so what we see is that it's taking a message, it's taking a code and exception, and those are optional in our case. And so we don't really need these here for this construction anymore. And so then here in our parent construction, we can just display this message. The use of post requests to this page is not advised. And so now we don't need this message here anymore because every time this is called, it's going to automatically set the message in the exception. And so if we go back to Insomnia and send it again, we can see we still get the message because it's still being defined, but we don't have to type it out every single time. And that's one of the major fundamentally great things about object-oriented programming and inheritance is the ability to remove redundancy. There's no reason to type that message out 100 times. If you're using the same class for all of it, you can type it one time and then just reuse that class. So that's just a basic look at implementing some exceptions in PHP. Okay guys, thanks again for watching this, the 5th episode in my PHP development tutorial series. As usual, I'll be down in comments, so if you need help with anything, if any of the code didn't work, or if you've got questions, comments, concerns, feel free to ask them there, and I'll try and help you as best I can. Or if you just want to showcase something you've built, I'd love to see it, whether it's PHP code or not. Be sure to connect with me on Twitter, Google+, on email, via my blog, and be sure to get subscribed so that you don't miss the next video in this series, where we're going to take a closer look at object-oriented programming and classes and inheritance, which we sort of touched on today with exceptions. And as always, thanks for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.